Our speaker tonight is Randall Voss, and Randall is the Commercial Fruit Crops Field Specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, where he provides technical assistance to fruit growers throughout the state. He has a wide range of experience in fruit production, especially in small fruits. Prior to working in Extension, Randall was a production manager at a wholesale greenhouse and taught production-related horticulture courses at a community college. So we're happy to have Randall here tonight to talk to us about grape pruning and canopy management. And with that, I will see you guys at the end at the Q&A section, and I will let Randall take over.
Well, hello there. Let me share my screen here. Get going. All right, so thanks for joining tonight. Yeah, it's been a little cold, obviously, so hopefully, maybe pruning is on your mind to think about, but not actually do. Just a little background. Here's who I am. I do put together a viticulture newsletter. It's geared towards commercial growers. So I don't know if that is maybe in line with your interests are, but I do post some stuff on Instagram and Facebook from time to time of stuff I'm seeing or some pruning tips or that kind of thing. If you want to follow along to that type of thing, and I'll post this at the end. But things we're going to look at today, first we got to kind of talk over basic grapevine growth and terminology, and then that's one of the negatives of pruning is it's kind of jargony, especially the grape world. There's some terms that maybe aren't aware of. Talk about some basic training systems just very briefly. I'll probably hit pruning a little bit more hardcore than the rest, just given the time of year, and talk a little bit about basic canopy management. So a couple things about grapevines is there's kind of 5 major tissues that we just want to make sure we're all on the same page on. There's the trunk, which is the vertical part of that plant, which makes sense. And we usually have horizontal wood. We call that the cordon. Some people pronounce it cordon. That's horizontal wood, usually on a trellis or a pergola or something like that. And then sometimes we have what are called arms, and that's old wood. And when we say old wood on a grapevine, we're talking more than a year old. And so arms extend off the cordon. Then we have canes, and canes is what was a shoot the previous growing season. And grapevines are a little bit different than other woody plants like apples, pears, peaches, where we are very aggressive at pruning. We're taking like 95% of the canes off every single year because these plants will tend to overbear themselves if we don't. When I kind of think about it, where's a grapevine native to? Well, it's in the woods, and it's usually on the edge of the woods or fence rows. And so in nature, only a small part of that plant is really exposed to sun. And so very little of that plant actually produces fruit. When we put it on a trellis or a pergola or something like that, we want lots of exposure. And so what that does to the plant, that it tends to overproduce, so to speak, if we don't prune it aggressively, unlike in a wild situation where just a small percentage of that plant is in the sun. So canes are what was a shoot last year, and these 1-year-old wood called canes is actually what produces fruitful shoots the following year. Shoots can come off of old wood as well, and they may or may not have clusters on. Some do, some don't, but canes are what produce fruitful shoots the following season. So when we talk about pruning and that kind of thing, cane management is really what we're talking about, because that is what we're constantly pruning back over and over and over again. So canes were a shoot last year, and canes are what produce fruitful shoots the following year. And those buds inside those canes actually already have the microscopic clusters inside them already. So those buds were developed already last summer. So those we already know how big the clusters are going to be next year if we could cut open and look at those buds. It's just we don't know how many are going to be pollinated. So this is just a written description of the trunk of these terms. The trunk is the vertical wood that's old. The cordon is the perennial wood that's horizontal, usually on a trellis. Arms are wood older than a year coming off the cordon, canes is 1-year-old wood that was a shoot last year, and it's got a smooth bark, so you can tell it apart really easy actually. And shoots are the current season's growth. So if we're looking at this part of a dormant grapevine, just to kind of reiterate this, because it is fairly terminology intensive. Here we have our cordon, here we have an arm, and all these smooth bark items that you see on here are canes. And again, we're going to focus most of our pruning on how do we handle these canes, which ones do we get rid of, how do we shorten them, and so forth. So our goal with pruning grapevines is to try not to have a lot of disorganization. So if we look on this cordon, we have three spots of what we call arms, A, B, C. You can see, especially on item B here, it's really gnarly. Now that may kind of be a pretty picture, but we really don't want this level of disorganization. We want these plants to have as uncomplicated of a structure as possible, because the more complicated the structure, the harder it is to prune, the harder it is to tell what's attached to what, and the more likely we'll actually have disease carryover. Because a lot of this old wood harbors disease, especially if it's dead. And so if we have real complicated arms and areas like we have on B, it makes it more challenging to harvest and prune, and makes disease management more challenging as well. So our goal is to not have this complicated of an area, and I'll kind of go through the steps of how I would suggest you go about that. So and I sometimes draw these cartoon grapevines just because it's hard to find perfect pictures. So just bear with me if they're kind of lame cartoons. But here's a shoot during the growing season with clusters. We have leaf fall, it becomes dormant. Now it becomes a cane. We prune back that cane, and off of that cane, we get fruitful shoots. And so if we get shoots coming off of old wood, they probably won't have clusters on them. So again, that's why we're worried about cane management. So there's lots of ways to trellis grapevines, and my suggestion is to keep it simple. This is a system called a high wire cordon system, where we have a cordon, which is that perennial wood, at about anywhere from 5 to 6 feet high. Most of the varieties we're growing in the Midwest have a trailing growth habit, and so it just makes sense to naturally allow those shoots to drape. So we're not fighting them. Some people like a more vertical shoot position system, which I'll show you a picture of it here in a second. We're fighting the natural growth habit of most of our grapevines, and we're trying to keep things simple. I don't know about you guys, but you get busy. I like to keep things simple. Why fight the natural habit of this plant? And so the way we usually train them is we have a trunk in the center, and we split it. So we have two cordons going each way. And an average vine in our area is going to fill about 6 to 8 feet. You can get them that they fill a lot bigger space, but the longer you stretch them out on average, the less vigorous it gets on those tips. And so while we could maybe stretch these out 12 feet or even longer, I'm certain, and sometimes that can work really easy if you have a high vigor site, I would encourage you not to though. So if we put them 2 or 3 feet apart, that's too close. So kind of 6 to 8 feet is kind of a sweet spot. Again, we have a cordon, we have canes, and we're trailing those shoots vertically downward. This is what some people call a VSP system, or vertical shoot positioning system. Some people call it the mid-wire cordon system, and I probably shouldn't list so many names. But here our cordon is low, so this is at like 3 feet, and we orientate the shoots upward. And the challenge with that, it looks beautiful if you're perfectly manicuring it. It's just a lot of labor. And if you have deer and turkeys, it's like a buffet, because those grapes, we hope, originate around the cordon. And so it makes them a lot more prone to predation. And also, if you're not managing these shoots to keep a narrow canopy, it just gets shade from above. So this is the other system that is common in our region, and I would encourage you to have the cordon high, just to make your life a little easier. But when you prune grapevines, really, I love doing it, not gonna lie. I mean, it gets old after you've done a couple thousand throughout the winter, but you bring order to chaos, and I get satisfaction out of that. And this is the same plant just after it's pruned, and it's a bit of a struggle if you're used to pruning apples, to realize how aggressively you have to prune grapevines. but this is what we need to do to get these plants healthy and to not have them overbear. And so you gotta have a little bit different mindset when you prune grapevines than other woody crops. And there's all the canes that got removed. So kind of I'm going to throw out some numbers here, and you don't have to count every plant. I'm just trying to kind of give you a background of where these numbers come from. But in the end of the year, in the growing season, we want about 4 to 6 buds per foot of plant. And I just always err on the high side 6 because some are going to fall off. You can always take some off, can't glue them back on, right? So I always say about 6 buds per foot. So if my vines are 8 feet apart, that's about 50 buds per plant. This is an exact science. And we can range them on the plant different ways. We can leave canes that have 3 buds, 4 buds, or 5 buds, or we call them nodes sometime. And anywhere from 3 to 5 node canes, you're in a good spot. I would discourage you from leaving a lot of 1 bud or 1 node canes, and I'll explain that here in just a little bit. And we try not to make big cuts. Now, if you've had a bit of a neglected vine, maybe you bought a place and you're trying to renew it, or you forgot to prune the last couple of years, it's hard not to make big cuts, but big cuts leave big wounds. And so our goal is to prune every single year and not have big wounds. And again, sometimes that's unavoidable, but that's our goal. So I mentioned, spur length or cane length when we shorten them. So here's a cartoon of a cane, and the little light colored things are the buds or nodes. On average, as you get farther down that cane, the buds farther down that cane tend to have bigger clusters and more clusters. Now, not every variety holds true to this. So if I leave 1 or 2 bud canes when I'm done pruning, I'm going to have fewer clusters and smaller clusters. Now, in the wine grape world, we don't really care as long as the yield is there. But if you're selling table grapes or you're trying to win the state fair to have the most beautiful grape cluster, the bigger clusters are near the tips of those canes. And so that's why I encourage people to consider leaving 3 or 5 bud canes, somewhere around there. You get them too long and things get kind of ungangly, but that's where that suggestion comes from. Not leave 1 bud canes everywhere, leave 3 to 5 bud canes. So talk all this about canes. Which ones are we choosing here? And really, it's one of those things where color does matter. And some of the generalities are the darker the color of that cane, there's a bark called periderm, the more sun exposed it is. And generally, canes that were in more sun have more clusters on them the following year and are more cold hardy. So we had this minus 18-ish. The canes that are pale in color are more likely to be damaged than the ones that are dark in color. And so that's an important way we can select against these canes that are predisposed to winter injury. We don't want the big, thickest canes in the world. We don't want the skinniest canes in the world. And so every variety is a little bit different. So you kind of look at your cultivar. There's a wine grape variety called Foch, and the canes are kind of a grayish color. So saying you need this dark brown color isn't really accurate for that one. But within your vine, you want to keep the darkest colored canes and get rid of the lighter colored ones. And I'm going to show you some pictures here. I'm a picture guy. So these are all canes from the same exact plant. You can see on the left-hand side, a lot paler in color. On the right-hand side, they're darker. And all these are what we call moderate thickness, so they're all a nice diameter, but the one on the left-hand side is going to be more prone to disease, more prone to cold hardiness and have fewer clusters on it than the ones on the right on average. That we're talking averages here. The other thing we want to avoid is something called a bull cane. Now, what is a bull cane? This isn't the best picture. This is showing the same cane, just different portions cut. And they have like an oval, if you cut into it, they kind of have an oval shape. These are crazy aggressive canes. I've seen them 20, 25 feet long. And they tend to not be as cold hardy and tend to have fewer clusters on them as well. So bigger is not better when it comes to choosing grapevine canes. We want to avoid the dinky little ones, but the super thick ones that if you cut into them have an oval cross section are also ones we don't want to leave. So moderate thickness. So, the whole pencil thickness thing we hear a lot. In some varieties, that might be the ideal diameter for a grapevine cane to keep, but in a lot of other ones, we want them slightly thicker than that, probably. Another thing that's kind of different about grapevines than say an apple tree. Apple trees set a terminal bud. So like June, July, that those shoots grow and they stop growing and there's a bud on the end. Grapevines have an indeterminate growth habit, kind of like indeterminate tomatoes. They just keep growing and growing. They don't stop growing. They don't set a terminal bud. So what happens is in the fall, as the days get shorter, the nights get cooler, and the plants can kind of sense that fall is coming. They start to harden off the canes from the base all the way towards the tip. And they can only harden off so much. And you can see in this top one, you can see a significant color change there. That's called dieback. And the only part of this cane that's alive are actually these two buds on the left-hand side. All the rest died because they never hardened off. And so that's another reason to avoid light colored canes is when you cut through them, as you can see in the bottom photo, the dieback is actually dead. So the plant never hardened them off. Basically, even though grapevines are a woody plant, not all the tissues are. And so on the right-hand side, that's basically like a tomato plant when we get a frost. Boom, it gets frosted, it's dead, it didn't harden off. And so I sometimes see people pruning and they leave all this dieback and those canes aren't alive. And you can cut through them to see the color change. You can sometimes see this change looking from the exterior. And actually, sometimes if you hit them with your pruners, they sound more hollow when they're dead as well. So dieback is not good. So if you look at this picture on item A, that cane is fully hardened off. Every part of those tissues is alive. On cane B, you can kind of see where in the middle, anything above it is dead. And on cane C, basically everything is dead. So nothing on that cane is alive. So don't prune to dead canes. And by only keeping the dark colored canes, we tip the balance towards that. We select against those. So even without having to cut through them, if we're only keeping the darker colored canes, we're getting rid of those dead ones. So some advice on pruning is when we're pruning, we try and leave canes that originate close to the cordon. Now, in this cartoon, I just left the canes as green so we could see them better. And so here I'm just going to show you an example of on the left-hand side, I'm intentionally removing stuff that has a lot of tissues that are extending away from the vine. So that's why these red cuts are here. And I'm intentionally leaving the ones that come close to the cordon. On the right-hand side, I'm doing the opposite. I am not intentionally keeping, so I'm leaving this one, this one, this one, and I'm cutting off the ones that originate near the cordon. And that's the opposite of what we want to do. So here is, again, a cartoon version of after pruning. If I do this, my fruit next year will keep getting farther and farther down to the ground. And that's not a good thing. We want the fruit to be high in that canopy so that it is in the sun. The farther down it is on the canopy, the more shade it's going to be in, the more likely it's going to have predation. And it just creates problems for the following year that keep perpetuating because it's going to keep getting lower and lower and lower. And so that's something we want to avoid. We want to try and select and keep canes that originate close to the cordon. We don't want these long arms. That's what this thicker stuff is showing. So here's an example of a grapevine arm that I cut off. And they actually have done an excellent job of pruning because this is actually 7 years worth of growth, 6 or 7, something like that. So the purple dots are the canes. Again, that's what's going to have the fruit on it this coming year. And I kind of color coded every year back. So the blue is 2 years old, the green is 3, the yellow is 4, the orange is 5, the red is 6. And so they've actually done a pretty good job of not letting that arm creep too much. It's only creeped, 2 or 3 inches a year, something like that, because they probably were aggressively pruning canes that originate close to the cordon. Because the cordon, I didn't want to hack off the cordon from this grower's vine. the cordon would be above here. And so I have the opportunity here. I got all these canes are pretty decent. They're all fairly dark in color, and some of it is just the lighting if they look different in color. But notice I have this cane in the upper left that is originating closer to the cordon. And so I'm going to go ahead and prune back to that. And if you kind of do that when possible, you're going to prevent those canes and that fruit from creeping farther and farther away from the cordon, because we want that fruit around the cordon in the sun. And so if you get nothing else from this webinar, it is when pruning these vines, select canes that are dark in color and canes that originate from near the cordon. So another thing I would encourage you to avoid is a lot of people, again, rather than just selecting a few good canes, they just like to prune back everything. Number one, it's more work because I got a whole lot more cuts. And so here you can kind of see I just shortened to every single cane that's on there. Probably not a good yield thing because remember we talked about the base of those canes are less productive than farther out, so probably going to hurt our yield. And it's going to be kind of a disorganized mess because we have shoots coming from everywhere. We probably got some old deadwood in there, and it's better to leave a couple good canes than 6 or 7 one bud poor quality canes. And so I got some pictures of that here to help with that. So here's again my cartoon version of that. I keep getting my arms longer and longer, and I leave these little stubby canes, and that's not good either. So here's maybe an example of what I wouldn't do. Number one, they probably left way too many buds, but if you look in several of these arm locations, you know, here we have a one bud cane right here, and we left a long one over here where we could have just cut this one right there and let that one be longer. Here we have 2 canes coming out of one spot. We have a cane coming from down here. We could have just lopped off this arm here and left that one good cane. And this grower might be going and you know, gonna come back and prune them again. But notice we just have a lot of just kind of junk in there. And that again is not our goal. We want it to be fairly clean and leave just a few good canes. So here'd be an example of that. Here's an arm, and there's some dead stuff in here that I should have pruned off. On the left hand side as before, and some people would maybe just stub every one of these canes back to 1 or 2 buds. It's better than just to leave one good cane that originates from close to the cordon. So, you know, I mentioned around 50 buds per plant. Again, that could be 5 10 node canes or 10 5 node canes, 12 4 node canes. You know, there's all different ways of getting at that rough number, but again, don't leave 51 bud canes. That's probably not the best way to do it. So I'm just going to take you through a stepwise process of how I would do this. And we're going to say this is like a 2-foot section of the plant. So bear in mind that this is about 2 feet of plant. So we want, you know, 10, 12 buds on there, something like that. So as I'm kind of going through this plant, you know, I'm looking at it. I want to, and this one is orientated vertically. So got to kind of keep that in mind. This arm, there's some nice canes up here, but that arm's getting long. I want to keep that arm close to the cordon. And so while those are nice canes, you're probably going to make those arms longer and longer. So I'm going to avoid that. If we look over here, we have some light color canes that maybe have some diebacks. We're going to get rid of those. We have a pretty thick cane right here, and it's hard to tell from a photo, but that's probably what I would be calling a bull cane. Its position is superior to the one we're going to leave, which is the one right here. But again, because it's a bull cane, that oval shape, leaving this one's probably a better choice. And then we could maybe use these as well. In this case, sometimes just because they're coming off in a weird position, sometimes we don't. But what I'm going to do is and I'll show you here in a little bit, I'm going to leave one bud on these canes right here. Then we come over to this arm area. We have some decent canes over here. Like this one's not too bad. This one has quite a bit of dieback in it. I got a pretty nice one right here. So I'm going to shorten this arm right there. And then, like I mentioned, I'm not gonna completely eliminate all growth here because we want to give ourselves options. We want things nice and clean, but if I completely get rid of every bud in this area, there's a chance next year there'll be no shoots coming from it. And so that's where we might leave a one bud spur that we call renewal spur just to grow a shoot in there. So maybe next year we have something to prune to. So then we shorten these back, and I think I'm leaving four bud spurs here in this particular example, and this is what it looks like. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4 buds on this cane right here, 1, 2, 3, 4 buds on this cane right here, and I left some one bud canes that we call renewal spurs, so that next year I have a shoot growing here. If I completely get rid of everything in those spots, sometimes they become blind, and then we kind of put ourselves in a corner where what if we need something there in the future? And so the bulk of these spurs right here are for fruiting, and these one bud ones, they'll produce fruit too, but their main purpose is to give ourselves options for next year. I want to point out one thing that I did incorrectly in this photo. Um, some of these are over 15 years old, so we've actually kind of viewed differently how we prune now, in that now we suggest leaving stubs. And the general rule of thumb in grapevine pruning is leave a stub about double the diameter of what you're pruning back to. And so the reason being is this is going to die and dry out. And if it dries out, it's going to dry out here where it doesn't matter. If I would have cut like I did here, which I did, it's going to dry out here, and then it's going to mess with the sap flow probably. And so, you know, a lot in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of kind of changes and thoughts in grapevine pruning, in that, you know, maybe we need to leave a few stubs here or there. Again, we want them clean, but that's something I've kind of had to retrain myself on a bit as well. So I mentioned, why do I leave that renewal spur? Well, and if we fast forward to next year, there's a chance on the bottom where if I didn't leave that renewal spur in the middle, I get nothing there. And yeah, since I did leave that renewal spur, I have a nice shoot growing there, obviously, because I drew it in there. And so perhaps, you know, maybe if this arm gets too long or something like that, we could get rid of it and prune back to that cane next year, or what have you. We just need options, because stuff happens, wind damage, deer damage, just diseases and so forth. We want to give ourselves options where we don't have huge gaps in the canopy. So I'm going to take you one more step-by-step process of pruning, and then I'm going to kind of talk about canopy management. So again, here's another vine section. And again, we'll say it's about 2 feet. So, you know, we need to leave anywhere from 8 to 12 buds in this area. So we have A, B, C, D are all kind of areas of interest where there's growth. A, B, and C have arms on them. D is just a cane coming off that cordon. And so if I look at this, you know, in here, item A, this arm, excuse me, this cane is coming close to the cordon. We'll keep it. We have 1 3-bud spur right there. It's a nice looking cane. It's originating close to the cordon, so we're sitting good. Item B, there's 2 decent canes here, but this one is originating closer to the cordon, so we're gonna cut the other one off. Again, I'm gonna shorten it to a 3-bud spur, because I want, you know, anywhere from 8 to 12 buds in this area. If you look at item C, we're starting to get a fairly long arm, and that's where it probably makes the most sense to keep the cane that's up here, because it's originating closer to the cordon. And can we leave 3 buds, give or take, on that? Now, you could argue, well, the canes from B and C are on top of each other now. Is that ideal? Not really, but it's impossible to find the perfect plant. Completely impossible. So sometimes that happens. We just want to get them evenly distributed. Then item D, it's a cane coming from right off the cordon. And so we knock it back to 3 buds, and now we have our 12 buds in this area. And this is a nice vine. It's nice and clean. They've done a great job of not getting too long arms, too intricate arms, and so it's easy to prune it in these types of situations. So shift forward to once there's actually shoots on these plants, which is hard to think about given it's cold outside. But again, the reason why we prune to 4 to 6 buds per foot is we want around 4 to 6 shoots per foot. And again, we can get into the research why. Basically, if I have only a couple of shoots per foot, there's too much sun, and we're not being efficient. We could have more shoots to harvest sunlight, get more clusters. If we get more than 6 shoots per foot, we probably get a little too much shade. And so, that's where those numbers come from. So on an 8-foot vine, that's got space 8 feet on its cordon. So we're looking 35 to 50 shoots, give or take. And the problem is, especially if we've had some kind of dirty pruning where we didn't have good clean cuts, and or maybe we have a lot of old arms on the plant, we may get 100 shoots coming off this plant because those nodes or buds on a cane sometimes actually put out 2 shoots, and then shoots can come off of old wood and so forth. So sometimes we actually do shoot thin also. And the question is, how much work do you want to put into it? It depends on the cultivar. Some you don't have to shoot thin at all, really. Others, they send out lots of extra shoots. And so we like to shoot thin before these things are firmly attached. And I don't want to have to use a pruners to shoot thin. I like to shoot thin on the trunk because we only have 1 trunk or 2 trunks for a reason. Either or, doesn't really matter too much. And if you kind of look on this trunk on the left-hand side, we left a lot of bad stubs in this situation. They way too long of stubs. And what happens then is you get a lot of these random shoots popping out. And now when these shoots are 6 inches long to 12 inches long, I can just grab them with my hand. If you're shoot thinning with your pruners, you're probably doing it too late. We want to snap these off when they're not firmly attached, and because it doesn't take much time at all. I mean, just flick them off almost. So we like to sucker the trunks. That's pretty important, unless you need a new trunk. And if you need a new trunk, they obviously leave a few. And we don't want to shoot thin so early that we miss some stuff. And so if you're looking at this part of this trunk or cordon, you can see there's actually 4 shoots growing there. There's 2 that are just starting to pop. And so this is too early to shoot thin because you're going to come back again anyway. Because really we want none of these because none of them are going to have clusters on them because they're coming from old wood, not a cane. And so it's great to get out early, but this is too early because we still have some that are yet to pop, as you can see by those little pink buds that are fuzzing out there. This is a decent time, and at this time we can already see which ones have clusters on and which ones don't. So it might be a little hard to see here, but off this cane we have shoots with clusters on them, which is what we want. Then off this old wood, we have a couple shoots with no clusters on them, and we have one that has a little tiny cluster. So we just grab them with our hand and rip them off. And it's actually better for the plant to rip them off early than to cut them off with your pruners later because they heal quicker. If it's just a kind of a lush green thing that you're flicking off versus a woodier shoot that you're cutting off. So I just do it by hand. Minute a plant, I just grab handfuls of them. In the commercial world, we don't, look at them with a magnifying glass to see do they have clusters or not. We can just kind of tell, okay, that area is not likely to, so just grab them all off. Anything on the trunk, we just strip them off, and really saves you later on a lot of time. So which shoots do we take off? This is the exact same time. So this is late May, and we can already see which shoots are going to be stunted. And there's kind of a hierarchy of shoots on these grapevines where um, if already in late May, early June, they only have a couple leaves on them, chances are they're not going to grow at all. And there's kind of some subtle ways to tell that. If you look at the shoot on the left-hand side, notice it's got a lot of tendrils on it. It's got a lot of young leaves on it. Notice all these other shoots have little to no tendrils on, and that's kind of a sign that these aren't going to grow much at all. And notice they have they don't have any young leaves on them. And so while these kind of small shoots, especially the right three, do have some tiny clusters on them, they're not going to add up to much. And so some people worry they're losing yield by shoot thinning. You're really not, because these tiny little clusters are going to have like 10 berries on them or something like that. It's just not going to add up to anything, but they are going to cause shade. And so we just rip them off in that, late May, early June timeframe. And we try and leave the ones that are actually going to produce enough leaves to ripen the clusters. A generality that's out there is you need 15 leaves to produce enough sugar to fully ripen one cluster of grapes. Now, that is like not an exact science because there's different size clusters and leaves and all that kind of stuff. But these shoots on the right-hand side, they have a cluster on, they're not going to get 15 leaves. So they're not actually helping the plant much at all. So here is a variety called Foch that tends to throw a lot of random shoots, and probably should have been thinned a little bit earlier because he's a little longer than what I'd like. But I actually counted them. There's 120 shoots on them. You can kind of see they're kind of stretchy, and they're in the shade. And this is what it looks like after shoot thinning. Again, this was just done by hand, just grabbing shoots. And again, it's going to help this plant long term. So the other canopy management thing I would suggest doing is something called combing on these high wire vines. And you want to do it when the shoots are 2.5 to 3 feet long. If you do it when the shoots are too short, number one, they're not attached well and they're going to snap off. And two, they're not going to stay put. So 2 to 3 feet, depending on the variety, is a good time to do it. And that usually is late June, early July. And if you want to, you can follow up again in late July to see if you need to do it again. And this is going to do a couple things. Number one is it's going to get sunlight into that fruit, which is good for developing flavor and all that kind of thing. And in June and July of the growing season, that's when the buds on those plants are determining how big the clusters are going to be for next year and how many there are going to be in that plant. So if we don't do our canopy management till August, all those buds are developing in the shade, and that is kind of telling the plant, hey, this bud is going to be in the shade, not the sun. Don't put resources into putting a lot of clusters on it. So there's a lot of reasons why to do canopy management early. Another one is disease. Diseases like powdery mildew love shade. They don't like UV light. They don't do well in UV light. So getting that fruit and the canopy exposed to sun early is going to reap benefits. So here's a vine that was not combed, and notice a lot of those shoots are growing horizontally, and that's not what we want. This is a nightmare to harvest, and it's even a bigger nightmare to prune because I can't tell what's attached to what, and it just takes way longer. And so combing these plants, I'll show you the pictures of that here in a second, takes time. Minute per vine commercially is what we usually talk about. I just kind of walk along and grab handfuls of shoots and orientate them vertically. Again, if you want pictures of it or video of it on, I think it's my Instagram account. I got some videos from the summer, maybe Facebook too, that has some of that. If you can kind of see that visually. But you're saving time because it's going to make pruning faster and harvest faster because you can tell what's attached to what. This is like textbook beautiful. All these shoots are orientated vertically. Doesn't have to be this perfect. But this is beautiful. Dappled sunlight, lots of fruit. That canopy is full. We want those shoots to grow all the way to the ground at the end of the season because leaves produce sugar. The sugar gets transported to the fruit. And the fruit doesn't produce its own sugar. We need leaves to translocate sugar into the fruit. So no leaves, no sugar. And this is a well-balanced plant. Sunlight, dappled sunlight. You can see the fruit. That this is a lot of work, and so probably if on the commercial side it's not cost effective, but this is, I mean, what we want to go towards. So here's a plant that should have been combed probably a month ago, because you probably can't see clusters on there. This is July, I believe, and now I've combed it, and you can finally see the fruit on there. Now this is too late. A lot of the negatives have already started in the plant, the issues with shade, and also now we run the chance of sunburn. You know, if you spend winter in Iowa, then you suddenly go to a tropical beach somewhere, you're likely to get sunburned too, right? Sudden go from shade to all of a sudden full sun. Same thing with these berries. If they did not develop in full sun, and we suddenly expose them to full sun later in their life, they're going to be very prone to sunburn. So here's the before, here's the after. So here's some pictures. These got combed, probably a week or two before this. I forget when. I got a little behind. No, June 27th. Yeah, this is the date I did it. So on the right hand side, I did no canopy management, and you can't see any clusters. Middle one, I combed these plants. Again, I just orientated these shoots vertically, and you can see the clusters. On the left hand side, I even did something called leaf pulling, where I pulled a bunch of leaves. Probably not necessary in most situations, but this was for a trial I was doing. And you can see that it definitely makes a difference. And here it is a month later, and this is a very windy site. And so, you know, a lot of people say that the shoots just reorientate themselves in the wind. And if you do it at the right time, that's negated a bit. But on the right-hand side, I can't see the fruit. So it's not good for the vine for next year. It's not good for the fruit this year. It's going to be harder to pick because it's going to take more time. It's going to take more time to prune next year because I can't tell what's attached to what. And it's more likely to have diseased fruit. The one that I combed is in the middle. On the right had combing and leaf pulling. So that paid off in this situation. So what I'll kind of end on here is cluster thinning. Do you need to thin clusters off the vine? And I'm going to say usually you don't, to be honest with you. Unless your vines are really low in vigor, you probably don't need to thin clusters off. There's some warning signs if you might need to. And if you're going to thin, you want to do it, you know, in June. If you wait till a week before harvest, you might as well not do it. And so I'm going to go back to this slide. These pictures, these shoots on the right-hand side, these 4 shoots on the right-hand side are telling us they can't handle the crop that's on them already. And so if you have short stunted shoots and you didn't thin them off, those are ones that you want to thin clusters off of. You know, these ones on the right, these 3 on the right, probably should have no clusters on them. The one second from the left can probably handle 1 cluster. The one on the far left has 2 huge clusters, and there's no reason to thin any of them off because the shoot is kind of telling us it's balanced, it can handle it. And so if we're thinning off these shoots anyway, we don't really have to do much crop thinning. Now, there are some cultivars that have huge clusters that you still may have to, but I would say just read the vine. If the shoots are stunted in late June, perhaps, then maybe pull off some clusters. If they're not, probably not necessary. Again, it's tough to know without knowing what cultivar you're growing, but those are some kind of generalities I would encourage you to consider. One other time some people consider thinning is at veraison, and veraison is when the grapes soften and turn color. And sometimes people will do what's called a green harvest. And if you see, let's say if 90% of the fruit is turning color and you have a few very green clusters, if you have the time, you might go and thin those green ones off because they're obviously delayed in ripening. In a month, all these are going to be the same color, and I'm not going to be able to tell which one of these is way behind in ripening. And so some people will go ahead and do that. For home gardening, probably not necessary. So you're probably not picking them all at once, but say you're making wine out of them, I don't want 10% of my crop to be behind in ripening. And so some people will do a green harvest then just to kind of narrow that ripening window up. But again, it may or may not be necessary. Um, don't get too antsy when doing it, because never do they all turn color at the same time. The last thing I'm going to mention that I would personally avoid, and then we'll open up to questions, is a practice called skirting. It really bothers people when grapevine shoots touch the ground, and yeah, it's annoying. And I usually say just let the lawnmower get them, but some people will very aggressively shorten these shoots back. Um, and I would discourage you from doing that because number one, leaves feed the plant, not fruit. Leaves produce sugar. And what also happen is when we do that early in the season, we'll get a ton of laterals popping on there. And now that fruit is way more shaded than it was beforehand. So here, the extra leaves down the bottom where it's not hurting the plant too much. Now, the response from, we basically pinch that plant is more leaves and it's covering the fruit. There are some reasons to do it sometimes, like just cutting them right at the ground level to help with harvest and so forth. But something like this is just not good. It's not good for that fruit. They cut off more than half the leaves, and that fruit's going to struggle to ripen, and those plants are set back for next year. So I would just discourage you from doing that. I know some people like things to look nice and organized, and I understand that, but it is not a benefit to the fruit this year nor to the plant next year. So that's my presentation. Again, thanks for your attention. I guess, Felicia, you want to pop in and see what questions are. We can go from there.